It was on a Sunday evening when the sun shone in the sky. As he walked his way to the Gaelic pitch, did he think he was going to die? And as he crossed the checkpoint, the sound of gunfire came. The news spread through that border town, Aidan McAnespie's name. Oh, why did you do it? Had you not the guts to say? You say it was an accident or even a ricochet. Just like Loughgall and Gibraltar, your lies are well renowned. Your mother, Aidan McAnespie, on his way to the Gaelic ground.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another webinar provided by the Ancient Order of Hibernians in America. The British Government Joint Committee on Human Rights has urged the government to reconsider moving the Legacy and Reconciliation Bill forward because of widespread breaches of human rights laws. This opposition is also backed by the Council of Europe's Human Rights Committee. Speeches in the House of Lords opposing the bill are numerous. One such speech by Baroness Olone stated simply, "The bill has been rejected by people, organizations, statutory organizations, former police officers and soldiers, including veterans who served honorably and have stated that criminals who served alongside them should be prosecuted. It has also been rejected by numerous independent and distinguished human rights lawyers and other experts, UN committees, and she again echoed the European Commission for Human Rights. Here in America, it has been rejected and opposed by political leaders from both parties, as well as the President of the United States. In the north of Ireland, we know that every political party opposes the bill. Today, we will discuss the historic verdict against the former British trooper for the 1988 murder of Aidan McAnespie, which would not have happened if this horrific amnesty bill was in place. I'm Danny O'Connell, president of the Ancient Order of Hibernians in America. Joining us today are Una McCabe, niece of Aidan McAnespie, Fergus O'Dowd, TD and chair of the Good Friday Committee, Niall Murphy, noted civil rights lawyer, and Mark Thompson of Relatives for Justice. Leading the way for us is Martin Gelfman, chairman of the Ancient Order of Hibernians in America, Freedom for Ireland Committee. Martin, take it away.
Cordia. Thank you, Danny. February 21st, 1988, a young Irishman walked through a British checkpoint between Achtercloy, town where he lived, to go to play Gaelic football just right near the Tyrone-Monaghan border. It's a checkpoint that he had to go through daily, either to work or to play football. It's a checkpoint where he was frequently stopped and harassed. And on that particular day, he was shot in the back by a British grenadier. 34 years later, on November 25th of this year, the verdict came down, finding that British grenadier guilty for shooting the young Irishman in the back. Today, the British reaction was to push ahead with the legacy legislation that Danny just talked about, to make sure that there are no other verdicts against British troopers for the murder of Irish civilians, and particularly for collusion or anything like that. And we're going to talk about this historic verdict. First, its impact on his niece. Watch it through the eyes of Una McCabe, Aidan McAnespie's niece. We're then going to talk about the impact on other families. We're going to examine the British Legacy Bill with Niall Murphy, one of the leading civil rights lawyers. And we're then going to go to County Louth, to a TD, who is the chair of the Good Friday Implementation Committee, to talk about what is being done in the Oireachtas, in the Dáil, to stop this bill from going through, to oppose it, to make sure that if it go through, that the Irish government will take action on behalf of the victims, Irish citizens on either side of the border. We're going to begin with Aidan McCabe. Aidan, one of the things that happened that people used to do in the 80s and in the 70s throughout the time of the Trouble is that if somebody was being harassed, they would try and publicize it. And they felt that getting publicity about this harassment or threats by the British would be a way of protecting the individual, that it would make it less likely that the British would try to assassinate him. And I think that that happened very clearly in the case of your uncle, Aidan McAnespie. Could you tell us what your mother and other family members did for him?
Hi, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I feel like I'm here on the legacy of my mother, Aidan McCabe, who I hope many online know was a human rights activist, not just for Aidan's case, but for the victims of all state violence. And in her legacy, I'm really proud to be here today to support other families in the prevention of this amnesty going through. So yes, you're absolutely right. In order to protect, it was very common here, not just for Aidan in an isolated case, but it was very common for families to raise awareness through the press and through political parties and through the church of the suffering that their families were going through. My mom and dad have a filing cabinet here in the house, and it was absolutely full of copies of statements where they would have went down and give witness statements and complaints of harassment that Aidan was suffering right up until the week before his death. He was referred to in the Sunday World as Ireland's most harassed man. And it is documented in a speech that my mom gave that she felt Aidan had come to a point in his life where he had made peace, where he was going to have a life continued harassment as a best case scenario, and worst case, he was going to be killed. So I think every effort in every opportunity that my mom and my dad and other family members had in relation to raising awareness to the harassment that not only Aidan but other local people in our community were suffering was an attempt to protect them. But as always, the British Army and the Military of Defence thought they were above the law.
Okay, on February 21st, 1988, you were at a family event. Aidan was there. What's your last memories of your uncle Aidan walking away to play Gaelic football, actually, just on the other side of that Octacloy checkpoint?
Well, I was 7 when Aidan was murdered, and I grew up in what wasn't a very normal childhood, but was very normal to me because I knew no different. We were at my great uncle's funeral tea at his house, and I was swinging on a gate with my cousin Joanne, and I remember the day very, very clearly. Initially, probably because I was a wee bit cross with Aidan. I was swinging on the gate and he walked past me and I said, "Where are you going?" And he says, "I'm going home." And I said, "Can I come?" And he said, "No." So I can remember feeling cross because I wanted to go with him. Me and my brother and my other cousin John were very, very close to Aidan. He was really, really crazy about children, and we loved him dearly. And I didn't understand why I couldn't go with him. So I continued swinging on the gate and playing with my cousins until I heard the screeching of cars coming up the road and somebody shouting, "Get into the car, get into the car." And me and my brother were bundled into my mum and dad's car. My dad was in the driver's seat and my mum was running around frantically shouting, "Where's my mum? Where's my dad? Who's got them? Who's got them?" And I immediately knew there was something terribly wrong. The atmosphere in the car was horrific. Me and my brother kept looking at each other going, what's happening? I remember being worried for my mummy because she wasn't wearing her seatbelt and she was banging on the dashboard of the car. And she was shouting, "They've got him, they got him." And that's all I could remember was her shouting, "They got him, they got him." And again, I kept looking at my brother going, "What's happening?" My dad never spoke. He never spoke a word. He just kept looking in front of him. And she was banging and banging, "They got him, they got him." So when we pulled down to the football pitch, obviously the community had all gathered. The footballers were all there. There was hundreds of people on the road. And I can only describe it as a 7-year-old sitting in the back of this car, knowing something horrific had happened, seeing people recognizing mummy and daddy's car, and the sea parted. And the sea parted, and all you could see was a body with a blanket. And my mum got out of the car and ran to Aidan. And my dad just shouted into the back, "Don't you move from the car."
And you found out your uncle had been shot in the back just after walking through, being admitted through that checkpoint that he had to pass daily to go to work or to play Irish football. Why did it take the Irish government? Your mother and family members were able to get the Irish government involved. They had a special Crowley report by a Garda commissioner. They had a state pathologist, a special state pathologist. They supported your family. There was a tremendous outcry. He shot in the back, and yet it took 34 years to get a guilty verdict. And your mother and other members of the family were instrumental in doing that, working with Mark Thompson, Relatives for Justice. What did it take for your mother and family members to campaign to get that verdict that you heard 2 weeks ago after 34 years?
Yeah, I suppose for the first 20 years of this case, my mum was fighting for Aidan, but also for other families, and was very pivotal in setting up Relatives for Justice. When I was sitting in the court last week, I felt like Aidan's murder not only robbed me of my uncle and my family of a normal upbringing, but it robbed me of my mum. And that's generational trauma. And I felt that this cost my mum dearly. It cost her life at 50 years of age from the stress. She got diagnosed with cancer, terminal cancer at 45. And I have no doubt that this played a massive role in it. But I have also no doubt that if my mum was here today, she would do it again and again and again, because that's the type of person she was. But my mum had to take she took Aidan's case with other family cases to Strasbourg, to America, to 10 Downing Street. And again, you have the state protecting the state. So it felt almost incredible that we were ever going to get justice, but she was never going to stop trying. And she kept knocking and knocking on every door, even engaging with the historical inquiries team at a time when it probably wasn't very popular to do so. But she was going to try every avenue to make sure that she could get justice for Aidan.
Okay. And when you went to court, you and other family members, you had to see Northern Ireland veterans who had banners, who'd be shouting, be gesturing towards you after the verdict. When the guardsman was found guilty of manslaughter, of shooting your uncle in the back, of manslaughter at that time, a British cabinet minister, Johnny Mercer, said that they're going to push ahead with legacy laws to make sure that this never happens again and that all these prosecutions are witch hunts. What would you say to those British Army veterans who supported the killer of your uncle? What would you say to that British cabinet minister about the legislation, the amnesty that they're trying to push through right now, despite all the objections?
Look, Martin, it's like this. Everybody is entitled to freedom of speech, and I'm not here to silence anybody, but neither am I here to be silenced, and neither should other families be silenced by this. I think that everyone has the human right to a judicial system, an accountable judicial system. And if the British government have got absolutely nothing to be afraid of, then why bring in this amnesty? If they have nothing to be guilty of, then prove that in a court of law. Do it the democratic way that it is done around the world. I think Aidan's case, provides a massive platform that no one is above the law. And I think that's the message to give to Mercer, is that no one is above the law, but we can't let Aidan's case be an isolated case. So from the Good Friday Agreement, Holden is the only veteran that has been charged and found guilty of a crime. So we can't let Aidan's case be an isolated case. Every single family, every single victim is entitled to the same process.
All right. Now, you made a special appeal. It was published in the Irish Times yesterday to Leo Varadkar. He is the incoming Taoiseach, will begin next week, resume the post of Taoiseach. And you made a special appeal to him to go to the European Court on behalf of all of the families who haven't got the justice, the truth that your family was finally able to get after 34 years. What was your appeal to him? What would your appeal be to people in the United States?
This is so important to me. I thought I would write down a few wee notes. And I have a number of appeals today. My first appeal is to other families. Use Aidan's case as an opportunity to seek your truth, to get your justice. On this, the National Day of Human Rights, your dignity and that of your loved ones is paramount. Your entitlement to freedom freedom from further pain, freedom from further generational trauma, and freedom to justice is paramount, and I stand with you. I hope that Aidan's case is the platform to give you hope and a voice. Not a voice because you aren't articulate, a voice because it highlights that even after the passing of time, justice can prevail, and I stand with you. Let the Trojan work that my mum and other human rights activists have done in the past be the shoulders for you to get your truth. As my mum Ailish said in 1992, if we are to overcome our past, we must make peace with it. This peace only comes from knowing the truth and equal access to a fair and accountable judicial system. I was able to visit my mum and Aidan's grave after the verdict, and I knew they were finally at peace. You and your families deserve this as well. Yet, this should not be left to you. This should not be left to the families who have already suffered so much. So my message to the American and Irish governments: I call on the American political leadership to ensure that this bill does not pass. On the 4th of September 1998, my mother, Ailish McCabe, handed a letter to the then President Bill Clinton in the Waterfront Hall outlining how 400 people had been murdered by the British Army and many, many more murdered due to British Army collusion. At that event, Bill Clinton pledged full support to equality of treatment and justice. Here I am, 24 years later, Ailish's daughter, making the same call to action to Joe Biden and those in American leadership. Time is so precious, but the time is now. To Leo Varadkar, I call on you to prioritise that on taking up position as Taoiseach on Monday, you make it clear to the British Prime Minister, Richie Sunak, that you oppose this legislation and that should it pass through the Attorney General, you will take a case to the European Court of Human Rights. I call on Leo Varadkar to publicly make known that the Irish government stand with victims and they stand with the human right to a fair, accountable and judicial process. I call on Leo Varadkar to meet with the families and reassure them that the Irish government support them.
Thank you, Ailish. We're next going to go to Niall Murphy in Belfast, a civil rights solicitor, we'll call it, a lawyer, and to talk about the bill that you've just spoken about so eloquently, what it would do, what it would mean, what would happen to other families in terms of their fight for justice, the way that your family was finally able to see justice for your uncle, Aidan McAnespie. Niall, you do a lot of work in terms of inquest. You've done a lot of work in terms of ombudsman report. We've had webinars on the Ballymurphy inquest, those families finally able to get the truth. We've had webinars on Operation Greenwich, Operation Achille, justice when truth came out for the Omar Road families, for those other families. There's been talk about justice through civil action. What happens to all of those things which have started to work in the past if this British Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Bill goes through as the British seem determined to push it through?
Well, Martin, just to be very clear and succinct, this is a legal horror story. If this bill was allowed to become law, it would deprive any citizen here of access to justice. You know, this is fundamental of that, as that access to the court. The courts would effectively be closed to victims and survivors of our conflict, and that any perceived liberal democracy in the Western world would attempt to legislate for impunity, for murder, should be a cause for concern for those who cherish liberty anywhere in the world. That it is happening in real time, in real life, in our doorstep is terrifying. I never thought that the British government would be as regressive and repressive as this. I always feared in my own mind's eye that they would perhaps ensure that there would be no further criminal prosecutions, primarily to protect their soldiers, because one has to remind oneself that thousands of Republicans and loyalists were prosecuted during the conflict. There were less than 5 British Army soldiers that were prosecuted. And when there was a mature, professional, reflective investigation into those cases, it became apparent that there would be more prosecutions. And that's why this legislation is coming around. I didn't think for one second that this British government would dismantle the office of the police ombudsman, would put chains on the courts of our coroner's court, and would deprive access to justice in civil cases. But here we are, they're doing it. And the appeal today has to be that anybody in America should write to their local congressperson. The American government should continue to be lobbied to ensure that this is raised at the highest level, that these concerns are raised at the highest level. And indeed, echoing Una's eloquent correspondence as published in the Irish Times yesterday, we must appeal to the Irish government that they will publicly assert that they will take an immediate interstate application to the European Court of Human Rights. This is alarm bells stage. I've been working on certain inquests for decades, and we're now coming close to a date, probably in the next 6 months, when families will be told this is over, go home. And that's not going to happen. But we need as robust an international diplomatic lobby to ensure that this British government is held to account.
Right. Niall, we just talked about, you have this legacy problem. You have hundreds of cases. And the things that were working are taking away. And actually, they're being taken away at a time when the British government was supposed to move forward. It had a Stormont House agreement with the Irish government in December 2014. And instead of that, it has new legislation. It has a commission or a review. Somebody described it as they're going to give all the victims another Widgery report, which was the whitewash that followed Bloody Sunday in 1972. What would the thing that the British are proposing, this ICIR, this review committee, why is that so unsatisfactory? Why is it so different from a historical investigation or any of the things that people are entitled to under the European Convention on Human Rights and under European court litigation?
It's not fit for purpose. It doesn't discharge the state's responsibilities, and I don't want to become too legally complex, but from 2000 to 2004, there were a series of judgments issued by the European Court of Human Rights, 6 cases that were taken, strategic litigation by lawyers of a generation older than me, but on whose shoulders any lawyer today is standing, visionary litigation, and that derived certain obligations on all states, of course, but in this instance, it was the British government, in circumstances where the state was involved in taking a life. And the mechanism by which the British government discharged those found failings. So throughout these 6 cases, the British government was found guilty of being a human rights abuser on the right to life. The British government were therefore obliged in discharge of their membership of the European Convention of Human Rights, or being a subscriptor to it. They were obliged to discharge those found failings. And the mechanisms that were proposed, now, Strasbourg has an office for the supervision of the execution of judgments, so that their judgments don't just sit on the shelf. And that office reviews the discharge of the judgments. the British government were obliged to say, what are you doing? How are you discharging these found failings? And it was the British government that proposed the coronial system, inquests. Dear Strasbourg, sorry for breaking the law on human rights. We now have a coroner's court that will look into these cases. And Strasbourg said, okay, coroner's court, that's good. What are we doing about RUC collusion? Well, we have the historic directorate of the police ombudsman. When the police ombudsman was set up, it did not have in its original envisage a historic directorate. The British government attached to the ombudsman's office a historic directorate to discharge its problems that it had before Strasbourg. So Strasbourg said, okay, a historic directorate of the ombudsman's office, that's good, okay. And of course, any civilian is entitled to take litigation. And there are hundreds of High Court writs issued before the High Court in Belfast. So families did have avenues for the first time to attain truth recovery and a mechanism of accountability. And of course, the gold standard was always criminal prosecution, mindful of the fact that it's an exceptionally high threshold to discharge the burden of proof, which is beyond all reasonable doubt. But now we have a circumstance when justice is finally arriving, and for the first time this century, arrived last week through the courageous persistence, dignified patience of the McAnespie family. For the first time, there was a British soldier convicted of a crime pertaining to their actions in the conflict in Ireland. And it was that tipping point that has finally led the British government to say, you're not putting our people in jail, and we are scrubbing the pitch. We're closing the courts, we're closing the Ombudsman's office, and we will do what we want. That cannot happen.
All right, Niall, normally the fear is that the British government is just going to push this legislation through because of domestic political party concerns within England for the veterans, and that English courts, British courts will say that Parliament is supreme, they have the power to do this, and the only really effective way to get justice, to get this overturned, to get back to the European Convention on Human Rights, to have that enforced, is in the European Court. How long, if you had a family today that they've been waiting for an inquest or some other justice for years, and this law gets passed and shuts it down, how long would it take for that family to go through all of the British courts? You have to exhaust your domestic remedies. Finally, to get back to Europe, to get back to have them say, you're now in the position which you are in today without this legislation, to have these rights to these types of proceeding restored. What are we talking about?
Well, for example, if this legislation was to be passed and become law in May 2023, I would anticipate a raft of inquests being listed for preliminary hearing probably in June 2023, for families to be advised by the presiding coroner that by virtue of the passing of that legislation, that he is now closing their inquests. I would anticipate, therefore, those families would take immediate judicial review proceedings of that decision, citing the unlawfulness of the new legislation. And if that was to be lodged in June, you would not get a hearing date until, with a fair wind, October 2023. Judgments are often reserved for periods of time, and I would not expect a judge in first instance in the High Court to deliver a judgment until early 2024. Either party, if the judge was to rule on behalf of the family, saying that the law was incompatible with the Convention of Human Rights, European Convention of Human Rights, I would expect the Crown Solicitor's Office on behalf of the British government to appeal that to the Court of Appeal. Then we're into a whole separate set of proceedings. I doubt that that Court of Appeal would conclude that case in the calendar year of 2024. And upon judgment, again, I would expect the losing party would appeal that to the Supreme Court. The backlog in the Supreme Court is, treacherous, and one would expect at least June 2025 before that would become to the attention of the Supreme Court in London. It's only, and you're quite right, it's only when the domestic remedy has been exhausted that a family would have the liberty to apply for an application to the European Court of Human Rights. And even then, when you would have a point of general public importance, it would be years in the system in Strasbourg. So I would fear that families would be subject to at least a 5-year delay if this legislation was passed and it was left to families by their own motion to pursue legal action against the lawfulness of this legislation. And obviously then thereafter, if the European Court was to strike down the legislation as being incompatible with the convention, you're back to square one. You know, it's not a case of the inquest court is just opened up again, or the Ombudsman's office is just, you know, dusting down its files. There's resource issues. Everything has to be recalibrated, and I have no doubt that the British government would attempt some form of legislative chicanery to attempt to modify the legislation. So I personally feel that the most effective, immediate and efficient way and appropriate way that this should be challenged is by an immediate application, an interstate application by the Irish government. And I'm delighted that Fergus is on this webinar, and I'm mindful of the fact that Fergus, as chair of the Oireachtas Committee on the Implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, has written on the 22nd of October.
We're going to give Fergus a chance to talk about that in a minute. But sure. You're saying, well, Mark, for example, had a woman named Mrs. Rafferty, whose son was killed 50 years ago at a meeting with Simon Covini. And you're saying it'd be, for someone like that, she's 90 years old, you'd be talking about 5 or 6 years, she'd be 95 or 96 before she could get back to where she is today if this does not become law. Is that basically what you're saying?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. All right, we now are going to go to County Louth. We're going to go to the chair of the Good Friday Implementation Committee. Fergus, just could you remind our listeners of what the Good Friday Implementation Committee is, how it's composed and what it does?
It's me. Thank you, Martin. Thank you for having me on, and to Danny, your president, for facilitating me going on as well today. I think the first thing is that our parliament is made up of government and opposition independents, and all parties are represented in our parliament on my committee. And the unique and special thing about our committee is that every member of parliament elected in Northern Ireland to the British Parliament are entitled to attend. And there are 18 such members, and of those 18, 10 of them attend our meetings. So the majority of elected people in the North and all of them in the South have participated and are aware and can speak and discuss issues in our committee. And I just want to acknowledge absolutely, you know, Aidan McAnespie. Every time I pass the spot where he was murdered, we all remember him because it's such an appalling crime at the time and still is. And I just welcome the battle that Una and her family have been successful in getting the only conviction since the Good Friday Agreement for these activities or activities of this kind. And our committee fully and absolutely supports the view espoused by what has been said here today, that the Irish government should take whatever legal action is appropriate at the European level, you know, to challenge the British government if this legislation passes. But it's not just as simple as that, Martin. That's not just what we've done. I don't say that in a rude sense. We have gone to the United Kingdom Parliament. We've met with Lord Kane, who introduced the bill in the House of Lords. We've had a number of meetings with him, and we've met representatives of all the political parties in the Parliament in the United Kingdom to push our point. And while Lord Kane has acknowledged personally that he finds this a very difficult legislation for himself, and he said so in the House of Lords, nevertheless, it is proceeding, notwithstanding that there are some amendments to it. but the House of Lords is not the House of Commons, and it's quite possible it could be defeated there. And I think that's the hope that we would have, that there's sufficient disagreement on what this is actually doing. But should it proceed into legislation and into law, well, then our job my job as chairman and our committee are unanimous in what should happen, and we're happy to work with you and work with all the parties, because this doesn't just represent this represents all people who suffered murder and trauma as a result of any action by armies or paramilitaries or whatever the perpetrators of these acts were. They were all criminal, they all murdered people, and people have no closure in many of these cases at the moment.
Right. Well, Fergus, one of the things about your committee, which is very unusual in Irish politics, it'd be more unusual in terms of American politics, is that you have to reach and do reach a consensus on every issue. And with that consensus, I know you met with Danny and members of the AOH when you were in Washington in June. We were able to meet Senator Schumer and others together. And you were able to, you said at that time, your committee would look into the issue of recommending an action, taking the British to the European Court. I know since that time, you've written a couple of letters to the Attorney General, who said that his advice is only for the government. But since at the last hearing, I believe it was on November 10th, you heard from Amnesty International, you heard from other victims' families. It was not the first hearing you've had on the issue with victims' families, with human rights. And I believe there is a motion pending now that was made at the last committee hearing that you were going to investigate bringing in the new foreign minister and directly asking him or her, whoever it may be. It's expected to be Micheál Martin, I believe, but it's not final. But or asking whoever is foreign minister to come in and to talk about the idea of bringing a European court action on behalf of the families.
Absolutely, Martin. Yeah, absolutely. You've got it exactly right. The foreign minister will be reappointed, or a new minister will be appointed this day week. And we're on record that we want that new person, if it is a new person, or Simon, who's doing a very good job, to come in to us. And that would be our absolute priority, obviously, in the new year. And that is absolutely certain. And the other point I wouldn't ever underestimate, having met you, Martin, bounding out of every woman went into it, Washington. Martin was there before us. I wouldn't underestimate the influence of the Irish Americans in the American political system, in the State Department, and in the office of President. Ireland has a great friend in getting peace and justice in our country. And Danny, who was there along with yourself, I was very impressed with the capacity of people for access and for listening and for action. And I think that President Biden has been very clear, on the protocol and other issues. And he really is a great friend of obviously Irish Americans, but also of everybody on this island, North and South. So I'm really hopeful. And I know that the new Prime Minister of Britain is of a different, has a different position on Northern Ireland than his somewhat less than illustrious predecessors, the recent predecessors. And I just feel that, I really feel that, there's an opportunity here for change and for accountability. And as Una said there, her case, I think, was 34 years. People have waited a long, long time. And notwithstanding the fact that it's so many years, it nevertheless, he says, it can help bring closure and also bring hope to all of those other families that you are fighting for. And I'm very conscious of that. And people, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, or whatever religion or persuasion they have or haven't got, but if they've suffered at the hands of violence and have lost loved ones, they're entitled to the due process. Even after this huge delay, and as people's lives, as they get older, it's 40 years in many cases since these evil acts were done. We need closure, and closure cannot be done by the British Parliament. It can only be done in the coroner's courts. and in the courts that follow, I think. Nobody can escape justice ever, in my view.
Fergus, you're right. Storm and House Agreement, all of these investigations, all of these mechanisms, they have to apply to everybody. I can't say as a Republican, I want killings of Republicans investigated, but somebody else doesn't get an investigation with the same right to truth. And I know you wanted to make that point clear.
Yes,
I'm
very
agreeing
much.
with you. I also, you mentioned about politicians. We had Senator Schumer in the Bronx a couple of weeks ago with Peter King, a former congressman, a very strong Republican, both of them talking about the bipartisan support in the United States on legacy behind the Irish, just the same way that you're able to achieve it with your committee. And I know you're looking forward, Leo Varadkar becoming the Taoiseach member of your own party. So I'm sure when you put a request to him, it's going to be have more weight. And one last thing, last time I know you gave a family shout out, and we both forgot to mention Debbie McGoldrick, your sister.
I have her name written here.
There you go. I'll let you. She and Ray O'Hanlon of the Irish Echo do a tremendous job on publicizing these webinars, all these appearances. They make it a very important issue. And I just want to make sure, I know you wanted to commend, I'm sorry if I cut you off and preempted you, but I know we wanted to get that out today because we both missed up the last time.
This is it here, Debbie McGoldrick.
Did you write that as we were done? All
No,
right,
no,
Danny.
no.
Danny, we're going to want to go back to you. Danny, you're on mute. Danny, you're on mute.
You have, that's a
I
story.
finally got to say that to you. You're always saying that to me.
That's right. That's the story of our life. I love it. I love the help we get from so many folks in the media and the tie and the help you've been able to do for us, Fergus, and really everybody here today has been tremendous. We want to thank Chris Cook too. While we're doing our thank yous, I don't want to forget Chris Cook, who is our video guy, our guy that's doing our behind the scenes connections and making sure we're doing a good job there. We do want to also welcome Mark Thompson, who's helped us put this together. Mark, and I'd be remiss if I didn't invite you to say something. Mark has been a partner with the Ancient Order of Hibernians in America on so many events, including the lobby, and we had the opportunity to go with Fergus and others to see some of the legislators together, and we ran into some of them separately, and Mark and of course his son Peter was with us and did a great job for us. Mark, welcome.
Thanks, Donny. It's a pleasure. I'm very humbled to listen to what Una has said. Very, very moving. And a great tribute to Ailish, who was a good friend of myself. Niall Murphy, one of our country's most eminent human rights lawyers, with a brilliant synopsis of this legislation in layperson's terms. And of course, Fergus too, to what he has said in his contribution. You can hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I just, Martin made a mention. I met Minister Coveney on Wednesday with a number of families. And Martin made mention of Maureen Rafferty. Yes, Maureen was 90 last Sunday. And this 30th of January, her son Philip, who had just turned 14 and who was abducted, taken away, tortured and murdered, shot 3 times in the head and his body dumped several miles outside Belfast by a UDA gang. I may say that same gang revisited West Belfast an hour and a half or 2 later. They abducted an 18-year-old boy. They took him away, murdered him. They returned an hour later again, and they tried to abduct 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl. Thankfully, the girl escaped and raised the alarm, and they drove off. They drove through a British Army cordon and checkpoint on each occasion. And that case has never been examined. Collusion has been found in it, and evidence, prima facie evidence. And she did say to Minister Coveney, I don't think I'll live to see justice if you don't stand up to the British government on behalf of every victim. And it's important, and I think now I'll give a wonderful synopsis of just all the hurdles and all the obstacles that people face. If the UK passed this bill, if it is violating the rights of victims in the Good Friday Agreement, the Human Rights Act and European Convention, the Irish government face a difficult decision in terms of what they have to do, but they need to do the right thing, and the right thing is to challenge it. In the hurdles, everything's out of the road. If the Irish government take the UK in an interstate case as now outlined, it'll only take several months to go directly to Strasbourg. A 7-judge chamber will hear the case. The UK, as the respondent, will have a right to respond. And if successful, it will go directly to the Grand Chamber and it will be heard. It'll all be done within 10 months. That's significantly important as the 5, 6, 7 years, the delaying tactics. And the reason this bill has come about, and now I think pointed it out so well, the ombudsman's role, the coroner's inquest, the civil courts. The reason why this bill has come along is because the processes that families are using are working too well for the British government. And this bill has been described as something akin to a rogue state and what dictatorships have did around the world in amnestying for their crimes, their troops and their governments. And it's been likened to Pinochet Plus. That's what it's been called. And the UK are among the rogues gallery of those types of states that committed huge violations. Minister Coveney pointed out that the Irish government, if that is the case, they want to solve this diplomatically, they want to solve it with politically, they want the bill off the table, and they want the UK to work with the Irish government in all the issues that have been successful in the peace process. The formula has been the parties and both governments, not the unilateral approach that the UK have taken. So in that context, they want to get it resolved and they want to avoid that. But if they don't, there's a decision faced by Dublin, and I think increasingly internationally and everywhere, that decision is the UK need to be taken to the European Court by the Irish government on behalf of every citizen and every victim. So I'm kind of leaving that with you. And there's talk about let's tinker with this bill and let's amend it. Let me say one thing. Talking to the British government about this bill is like asking an arsonist to put out the fire. It simply isn't going to work. The diplomatic processes and channels are at play. Let's see what the British government do. But my fear is that, and we've seen the bad faith consistently each and every time, the Irish government need to indicate to them now publicly, if they go down this route, well then the consequences could be they could be in Strasbourg again, like they were with the hooded men. So I want to thank everybody. I want to also pay tribute to Aidan McCabe, a close friend of mine, a founder member of Relatives for Justice, a mentor to me. And her and I travelled the world. We travelled all over Ireland. We travelled to Geneva. We give evidence to the Human Rights Committee in Geneva. We travelled to the United States. We travelled to Europe. We met everybody in the great and good that came, including, as Una rightly points out, President Clinton. So, you know, we're standing on the shoulders of giants too, as Niall rightly pointed out, on lawyers, but also people like Aidan McAnespie. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And that's a great words for us to end with. But what we are going to do is the folks that spoke before, Mark, we're going to give you each one last chance to for a closing comment, because just as Fergus remembered about his sister-in-law, we want to make sure everyone has a chance to make their closing comments. And Una, we're going to send you a link as soon as it's over. Your time on this call was spectacular. And anything you'd like to say to end here?
Yeah, I think I just want to talk about time. My grandfather died just some short weeks, 8 to 10 weeks before this verdict was made. So he never got to hear the result. And although I'm sure he's absolutely, totally relieved now and in a better place, he died a tortured soul. There's no, the families deserve truth and they deserve justice, but they need action now. We can't afford any more delays, and everybody's entitled to the same day in court that we got.
Thank you, Una, and you're absolutely right. Everybody is entitled to their day in court, and it should not be 30 plus years later. Niall Murphy?
Again, just in a similar vein to what Una said there, one of the most long-standing inquests that has been before the courts in Belfast is the Stalker-Sampson series of inquests, which touches upon the deaths of 6 men in North Armagh in late 1982, shoot to kill operation by the RUC. And Those inquests have never been heard. There wasn't even a perfunctory discharge of the state's obligation, and they have been extant before the court for 40 years. And on Monday, the 12th of December, it's the 40th anniversary of the murders of Roddy Carroll and Seamus Grew. And I would just like to pay tribute to another founding member of Relatives for Justice, Tommy Carroll, who instructed me in his brother's inquest. That has never been heard. That is vulnerable to this new legislation. And Tommy passed away in recent weeks, and is another person who died without access to justice. An inquest is the most sterile legal format. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody writes a check. It's solely about truth, what happened. And for all those families that are to be denied the opportunity for the truth, what is intended by this British government is a mortal sin.
Absolutely, now, absolutely. And Fergus, your committee, one of the spectacular things you touched upon it is you are inclusive. You're inviting everybody into the committee. We're hearing from everybody as part of that committee. A stark contrast to the British government saying we're going to unilaterally change things that we agreed to, we signed off on, but all of a sudden we don't like them today. And when, as Americans, when we're talking to our legislators and our executive branch, we're saying, how can we sign agreements, whether it be trade or anything else, with a country that the agreements they sign isn't worth the ink that they're signing them with? And so congratulations to your committee for that. And your closing words, Fergus.
Well, they're very simple: to wish everybody, first of all, a very happy Christmas. It's that time again. I must put up my tree. I see some of you guys have them up there already. It shows you how busy I am. I'll just say that I think it's about reconciliation. It's about peace. It's about looking to the future. It's about helping families, even after 30, 40 years, to get justice. And I think we all want that. In my own county, I remember Jean McConville, who was murdered by the IRA. I remember Tom Oliver, who was murdered as well. And I think of their families also, just as I think of Una. And I think of, we can only move on when people have the truth and reconciliation. Everybody has to embrace a future together on our island, and the help of Irish America, is hugely important in that. So I look forward to working with you, and hopefully we'll visit again, Martin and Danny, in the new year, America, and push forward on all these agendas. And the last thing I'll say is that I'm very proud that President Biden, his ancestors came from County Louth, and it's the best place a president can come from.
Right, and we're looking forward to him as well as others visiting Ireland in the near future, and hopefully putting a little bit of an exclamation point on this. Mark, we're winding down here. We've got Mark and Martin, and we're going to close. Go ahead, Mark. Any last words, Mark?
No, Danny, I'll hand over. Thank you.
I love your tree, and Abby and I are putting ours up tomorrow with the kids, so we're looking forward to it. Martin Galvin, as I give you your last words, I'll remind everybody we're in the middle of our Freedom for Ireland Christmas Appeal campaign. Chris Cook put a link in the chat, so you could click to that. You can also get a link to the verdict and read it for yourself. And we're not done. That's just the beginning of. It's just a new beginning for justice in the North Ireland. Martin?
A couple of things. Number one, just as I was watching and listening to Una, I couldn't help but think how content she is, or happy she is, how much that verdict meant to her, and I'm sure to her whole family, and how much the absence of justice and truth would mean to all of the other families who feel as strongly, as deeply, I have a strong attachment as she does, and the McAnespie does. They have no less a desire for truth, and now they have to be afraid that they're not going to get it because the British government is going to deny them, and it may even be that they're just somebody like Rishi Sunak would just say, let it be some other British prime minister's problem if it goes to the European court. That's how callous it is. That's how they deal with the victims in Ireland. In the verdict, the striking thing about it is 34 years ago, and there was no new evidence. no new evidence 34 years later, a finding of guilty. And that's the truth about so many of the other cases. On the Christmas appeal, money that people give allows us to support relatives for justice that Mark and Una's mother, Ailish, and others work so hard on and have meant so much to us in what they can bring us. So I just ask people to do that. And most important, this is a continuing thing. When we have a program like this, we pledge all of the victims that we're going to work as often as it takes, as long as it takes, the AOH and the other Irish American groups that join us today. And we thank them, the Unity Conference, the Ladies AOH, the Brehons Irish Northern Aid, where this is a continuing commitment that we're behind their fight for justice, and we're never going to let that down. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Martin. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined us as we get ready for our close here. We've had representatives from many Irish American organizations, including the Ladies Ancient Order of Hibernians. Thank you all for joining us. Hey, happy Christmas to everybody. I will tell you this, Una, I looked up the memorial, and I plan to be, as you said, I plan to be in Ireland for Easter, and I'm going to make every effort to get there when I'm there in April. Thank you all for joining us. Chris, if you'll cue the music. God bless you all, and happy.
It was on a Sunday evening when the sun shone in the sky. As he walked his way to the Gaelic pitch, did he think he was going to die? And as he crossed the checkpoint, the sound of gunfire came. The news spread through that border town, Aidan McAnespie's name. Oh, why did you do it? Had you not the guts to say? You say it was an accident or even a ricochet. Just like Loughgall and Gibraltar, your lies are well renowned. Your mother, Aidan McAnespie, on his way to the Gaelic ground. For years he was harassed by the forces of the crown. As he went to work every day, he left his native town. The soldiers swore they'd get him for reasons no one can say. But sure enough, they murdered him in cold blood on that sunny day. When the people heard the gunfire, they came from miles around. They saw the young man lying there, he was dying on the ground. His cold blood was bleeding fast, though people they tried their best. The bullet wound was far too deep, it had passed right through his chest. Oh, why did you do it? Had you not the guts to say? You say it was an accident or even a ricochet. Just like Loughgall and Gibraltar, your lies are well renowned. Your mother, Aidan McAnespie, on his way to